Welcome to Cause Before Symptom, uncovering the real cabal and spiritual forces that are controlling the world. And now, here is your host, James Carner.
Welcome to Cause Before Symptom. I'm your host, James Carner. Today is May 29th, 2026, and tonight's episode is all about the spare tire revolution, how China is changing the rules of the technology war. Now, for more than 3 decades, 30 years, the technological world operated under a set of assumptions that seemed unshakable. The most advanced chips come from a small group of companies. The most powerful softwares were developed in the West. Critical patents, manufacturing equipment, and financial systems formed a network that appeared impossible to challenge. Now, many believed that any nation wishing to compete would have to follow the same path and play by the same rules. Then China encountered a different reality. Faced with sanctions, export controls, and growing restrictions on critical technologies, it began pursuing a strategy that engineers call a spare tire approach. Well, instead of relying on access to foreign systems, China started building alternatives for everything it considered essential. And what began as a defensive effort to reduce dependence gradually expanded into a broader vision of technological self-sufficiency. Now, this show explores how that strategy evolved from backup plans into a challenge to the existing technological order. From semiconductor manufacturing and artificial intelligence to photonic chips, advanced packaging, quantum computing, and predictive systems, a new race is emerging. And the question is no longer who can build the largest data center or the most powerful chip. The question really is who can discover the next architecture of computation itself. And along the way, the audience will examine the hidden importance of patents, supply chains, energy consumption, and information processing. They will learn why the future of power may depend less on military strength and more on the ability to predict, compute, and innovate. Most importantly, they will see how technological revolutions rarely come from perfecting the old system. They come from those willing to build a different one. Well, the spare tire revolution is not a story about East versus West. It's a story about what happens when a nation decides that the safest way forward is not to compete on someone else's road, but to build an entirely new one. As the world enters an age of AI, quantum research, photonic computing, and unprecedented technological change, well, the rules that shaped the last generation may no longer apply to the next. It's going to be a good show. Looking forward to it. Shout out to everybody on the live chat rumble. Number one warrior is Scorpion. Scorpion says, it feels great to be back with you, Pastor and Warrior family. I hope all is well. Thank you very much, Scorpion. Glad you're here. God bless you. Number two warrior is the Boots Half Man, Spleefer, Sparker guy himself. I forgot what I said yesterday. I was like, Boots, half man, half nerd. What's so funny? Boot says, loving it, slaying the dragon. The almighty God has it under control. All right. Hello, James and Warrior family. Hoping everyone is feeling all right. And let's hit that thumbs up button. Yes, guys, if you can all do me a favor, take your thumb, follow my thumb. Go like this. Go down to your phone like I'm doing. And if you could hit the X button and then hit thumbs up and then hit live chat, you won't lose your spot, I promise. Thank you so much. All right, guys. Well, you know what time it is. Let's get into breaking news.
Welcome to Shitty Breaking News with your host, James Carner, offering his shitty opinion.
So apparently a judge orders President Trump's name to be removed from the Kennedy Center. I guess Trump reacts with fury. Who cares? Live updates. Trump holds key White House meeting on the Iran deal to reopen Strait of Hormuz. Well, maybe this is it. Maybe we're going to come to an agreement where Iran pumps oil and they give us money. Well, that's what's going to have to happen. 13-year-old, 7-year-old among 5 killed in a massive car crash on I-95 in Virginia. Really bad accident. So sorry that many people died of that. My heart goes out to them. God bless those families. Judge halts Trump anti-weaponization fund after January 6th prosecutor sues. Well, that's interesting because another judge opened the case back up and wants the IRS to give $20 billion. This is interesting because they're calling it some weaponization fund, and that's not what it is. It's the money owed to Trump and his family. He sued them personally, or his company. No, not personally, but his company sued them because they released his tax records. The IRS, they used their power to try to influence politics, and that's wrong, and they got caught. And the deal was the IRS would give Trump $1.8 billion, and the IRS and him would close the case and just drop it, drop the case. So it was a settlement. And then all of these other Democrats are now saying, hey, that's not fair. These people went to jail on purpose. Well, Trump thinks that they went to jail through politics, meaning it was used against him. And I believe a lot of people did go to jail. And I even knew one of them. I remember watching this dude that I knew. I only knew him through my industry and through trade shows, but you know, he knew my name. I knew his first name. And we watched him live on Facebook storm the Capitol. They didn't storm it at all, dude. There were little areas that they could go and they couldn't go. And they were just all walking through the Capitol. And then they walked on the outside of it. And which is weird because I saw it live. Nobody was stealing anything. It just seemed like they were directing him through these little gates areas, and they all went there, and that was it. But then, man, you know, the news comes out and says, no, there's other places where there was doors being beat down and people shooting each other. Who knows? We can't trust what's put out there in the media. But what is happening with this whole Trump thing and this weaponization, anti-weaponization fund, which is funny because that's a made-up word. Just call it what it is, a settlement for Trump. And Trump said, I'm going to give that money to help those who need lawyers to get out of jail from walking through the Capitol. Now, if there were those who went in there with violent intentions and with weapons, yeah, that was stupid, you know. And if you're gonna storm the Capitol and take over America, you know, you're going to need more than just American flags and even a 45. But regardless, those people who were put into jail without any representation at all for years, well, yeah, they don't we have a law in the Constitution? You're allowed a speedy trial, and well, under Biden, nobody got any trial at all. And they just were sitting there rotting in Washington, D.C., which has no jurisdiction to any other state. So this is why they could get away with what they did, the Department of Justice at that time under Biden. So what we're seeing, guys, is through Biden, through Trump, they're all using our government institutions to play politics, and all of that's wrong. Trump should not do it. Biden shouldn't have done it. Obama, none of them. But they're doing it, and that's now just a Tuesday. Okay, so get used to it, okay? Every single president now, going forward, is going to use the government for their will. That's just it. And there's nothing you can do about it because once it's started, they're not going to stop because, well, it works, and it's working now. Sorry, it's not like I'm doing it, but that's just how it's happening. Second poll shows Becerra is ahead in California governor race. Who gives a shit? Kenya court suspends U.S. plan for Ebola quarantine facility for Americans. So Kenya's like, we just don't trust you. So So apparently, there won't be an Ebola quarantine facility for Americans in Kenya. So, hey, look, if you're gonna travel the world, you're gonna get you're gonna eat shit that your body's not used to, and you're gonna run into bugs and things that your body's not used to. So you're taking a risk. So anytime you travel, just know that you're taking a risk and stop blaming everybody else for it. Otherwise, you're just being a victim, and victims don't work in this kind of an economy. All right, when we come back, tonight we're going to be talking about the spare tire revolution, how China is changing the rules of the technology war. I'm looking forward to it. I hope you are too. Stick around.
Every year, millions of Americans sign a contract they don't even know exists. They think it's just another tax return, but that signature means something far deeper. It starts with that first job at 16. The system takes a piece of her check, then promises to give some back if she signs the return. Every April 15th, the same cycle repeats, not by law, but by belief. The system didn't bind them, their own signature did. Learn the truth at unincorporatedassociations.com.
All right, and we're back. We got less commercials now. Boot says, brother, we got together with my neighbors, but we haven't even seen each other since 2023, so that's like 3 years ago, when everything is we're going on about families, and it was like I wasn't even there. What is going on? I don't know, Boots. Can you be a little bit more specific? I don't understand the question. Are you saying that you got together with some neighbors that you haven't hung out with for like 3 years, and you were there, and everyone was getting along, and it seemed like you were not there? Well, if I'm understanding you correctly, this happens to me all the time. Anytime when I am with a group of people, I don't know whether it's because, I'm more in tune with God and just doing the right thing, that I'm holding my tongue and I'm watching myself and I'm being respectable, but yet not just sitting in a corner. And it seems like everyone is oblivious to what's really going on. And that's what happens when you get, I guess you could say, I hate saying this because it's so cliche, but when you get woken up to a fallen world, and then you have to figure out ways to participate in it without participating. So everywhere you go, it's going to feel uncomfortable. Everybody you talk to, they're going to be talking about the world and not talking about, things that really matter. Like the most simplest thing is loving your neighbor. And you're going to feel alone because nobody is on the same road as you are, because you're now trying to love your neighbor as you love yourself. And people are not used to that anymore because society has changed. It's now societies are victims, and victims need attention, not love. Love is recognizing if someone is playing the victim role and telling them that there's better ways than going about it that way. Being a Christian is hard because you see the corruption in people, and sometimes if God tells you to do it, you expose their corruption. And sometimes when you get together with a group of people that you used to hang out with and everything was normal and now it just doesn't feel right, it's because you're changing, they're not. I don't think it's a bad thing, but I do know that the Christian road, especially for prophets, they're very lonely because they don't fit in this world. I hope that kind of explains what may have been going on. I'm not sure, Boots, but if you could, we'll stop the show and get that question answered because I really want to understand what you're talking about. Yeah, there you have it. All right, guys. Also, Robert Gerson is here saying, hey, y'all, grateful to be here. Can't wait to learn how China is revolutionizing their takeover. Must be the long game. Well, they're trying. And who knows? I can't predict the future, but all the governments now, they believe that the more data centers, the more information they collect on people, the more they can predict the future. And well, that's where they're going. Well, AI, guys, it just hit the world 3 years ago. It's not stopping, and things are going to just change so dramatically and so fast in the next 10 years that we're going to just wonder how we got through it, because technology and how fast it's moving now, it's faster than it's ever moved. It's breaking records, and we just don't know what to expect because we've never been here before, or at least that we can remember. And one thing I'm thinking is, what we really do need to remember is, remember that we come from Eden. That's our home. That's where we're supposed to be. So never forget your origins. Never forget that you are a child of the Most High. Never forget that your Lord is Jesus Christ, and you made a choice to follow Jesus. And that means you're going to stand out from the rest of the people. And they're going to hate you, or some will love you. But the Bible says they're going to hate you for his name's sake. So keep that in mind, because as technology grows and the people grow towards technology, the less they're going to want God. Boots says, I'm thinking, James, you got it to the T, because we're all talking about the same thing. But when I speak, it's like I'm not even there. Well, I don't know, Boots. I wish I had an answer for that. Yeah, because probably what's coming out of your mouth, they don't want to hear it. The closer you get to God, the more things you talk about godly things, the more it's just not part of society anymore. And so what we need to do, we just need to recognize that. Use wisdom, Boots, wisdom. It's okay if they don't want to hear what you have to say. And it's okay to be yourself, but it's not okay to tell people what to do or tell people how to think. Just play along with it. You know, those that have eyes to see and ears to hear, and they open up and they actually listen to you, then God will take over the conversation. But when it comes to talking to people who are not on the same level as you are, seeking the truth and finding the kingdom of heaven, that's really what this show is all about. Finding heaven on earth, because it is here. It is. We have access to it on a daily basis. We're told that it is, right? Because, well, we live in a fallen world, and the kingdom of heaven, I believe, is everywhere around us. We just don't see it because, well, all we see is evil. But the kingdom of heaven is there. We just have to stop looking at the bad things and start focusing on the good things, because that's what the media is doing, getting us to focus on bad. Bad. Because, well, all bad shit sells. It's not me. It's the people who figured it out. All right, guys, China. Now, for most of human history, power was measured by the things that people could see. We talked about this last night. Who had the largest army, or the strongest fortress, or the biggest navy? Nations fought over land, rivers, ports, and resources because those assets determined who would prosper and who would struggle. And when one empire defeated another, the outcome was often visible on a map. Borders then moved, flags changed, cities fell, and the winners collected the territory, rewrote history, and then the losers learned to live under the new rules, right? Boot says, if I'm not here on your show, it's like I'm dusting to wind and say, what is going on? I love my neighbors, but why can't they see me? I don't know, Boots. What I'll do is we'll talk about this personally. And, right, I'm thinking it's more of a demonic attack. Now, because the way you're talking now, yeah. No, you're not dust in the wind. You are highly favored. You're mighty. You're wealthy, blessed child of the Most High. Don't worry about that. We'll talk. I promise. So the winners collected the territory after a war, right? And the losers learned to live under the new rules and rulers. And today the battlefield looks very differently, right? It's so different. It's so bizarre. It's so weird. And the most important struggles are often invisible to the average person because they're not paying attention. They take place inside research laboratories, semiconductor fabrication plants, data centers, patent offices, and university engineering departments. But not in your eyeballs, not in your ears. And the weapons are no longer just tanks and missiles. Even though we see it in Iran, there's other wars going on, the informational wars that you just don't know. They're algorithms, manufacturing processes, supply chains, and computation architectures. And the nation that masters these systems increasingly shape the future, while those that depend upon them, well, they find themselves following rather than leading. And I think this is why Europe is struggling so much, because Europe didn't keep up with AI. Neither did Russia for some reason. They're not on the top at all, which is surprising. You'd think that Russia would be a leader in the AI stuff, but China somehow blew them out of the water with AI and manufacturing chips, and Russia seems to be left holding the bag. Very strange. That's unlike Russia, okay? But it could have been because Russia just wasn't ready, because they just finally got their nation back from communism. So the United States dominated software and chip design. Europe controlled critical manufacturing equipment. Taiwan became indispensable to semiconductor production, and the financial system rewarded those who participated in the network and punished those who challenged it. Well, to many observers, this arrangement appeared permanent. The world's technological highways had already been built, and everyone else was expected to drive on them. Then something unexpected happened. As tensions grew between major powers, technology itself became a geopolitical weapon. Access to advanced chips could be restricted. Equipment shipments could be delayed. Sanctions could limit who received critical components. And the assumption behind these policies was simple. If a nation depended on someone else's technology, well, that dependence could be used as leverage. Well, the logic seemed sound. After all, how could a country compete if access to the tools of competition could be turned off and at any moment? Yet history often surprises those who believe the future will follow a straight line. Instead of accepting permanent dependence, China began pursuing a different strategy. Engineers and policymakers started building what they referred to as spare tires, not because the replacements were immediately better, not because they were always cheaper, not because they could instantly replace every imported technology. They built them because dependence had become a risk. A spare tire exists for one reason only. When the road changes unexpectedly, survival belongs to those who prepared for another option. That's hence the spare tire. And what started as a backup plan gradually expanded into something much larger. Domestic chip development accelerated. Alternative software ecosystems emerged. New manufacturing methods received enormous investment. Researchers began exploring photonic computing, photonic meaning it's light that goes through the CPU and not electricity, which is pretty cool. Quantum systems, advanced packaging. This is folding computer chips on top of another, because computer chips used to just be thin. Now China just came up with a new way of folding them on top of each other so that they communicate faster by going this way instead of all around the computer chip like this. Does that make sense? Okay. Vertical, horizontal. That's all it is. So the goal was no longer simply to catch up. Okay. I mean, researchers began exploring the photonic, quantum, advanced packaging, and architecture that looked very different from the traditional path followed by Silicon Valley. So the goal wasn't about catching up. The goal was to ensure that no single point of failure could determine the nation's future. Well, that brings us to the question at the heart of tonight's show. What happens when a rising power stops trying to win the existing game and starts trying to change the rules? Now, throughout history, dominant empires often assume their advantages are permanent. They become experts at the current system and then spend enormous resources defending it. Well, challengers, meanwhile, search for weaknesses, alternatives, and opportunities to leap ahead. And sometimes those efforts fail, sometimes they create the next era. Well, the headlines that we see today may look disconnected. A new AI chip, a photonic assembly line, a quantum experiment using only a handful of spins. That spins in the qubit world, and a breakthrough in advanced packaging, which is folding computer chips on top of another to communicate faster, and a debate over semiconductor sanctions. Yet when viewed together, all of these headlines, they tell a larger story. Because beneath the surface, a global race is underway to discover the next foundation of technological power. And the winner may not be the nation with the biggest data center or the largest budget. The winner may be the nation that finds a more efficient way to transform information into knowledge, knowledge into prediction, and prediction into power. And China came up with a 9-qubit quantum system. This is a university in China, just recently, about a month ago, that can predict the weather better than our fastest supercomputer quantum shit. So this is why I wanted to do the show, because they didn't need 1,000 qubits like, what was it? Microsoft created this 1,000 qubit chip, and all of these quantum chips with qubits, they all fail because they're inaccurate. Because remember I was telling you guys, it's about flipping a coin, and you put 4 qubits, and they're flipping coins, or like, well, they pick the outcome, and it's just it's slot machine gambling. Okay, you just don't know what's going to come out, and usually quantum computers are anywhere between 60 to 70% wrong in their answers. So when they say, hey, we just solved an equation with our quantum computer that would take the largest supercomputer 2 trillion years, what a bunch of morons. They didn't solve it. It says it solved it, but it didn't really solve it. So they're liars. So tonight, the focus is not on fear. Okay, don't worry about it. And it's not on hype. Chill out, honey bunnies. The focus is on understanding the deeper forces shaping the future. Because the most important revolutions rarely announce themselves with a declaration. They begin quietly in laboratories and workshops long before the rest of the world realizes the road has changed. And when that realization finally arrives, the spare tire that once seemed unnecessary may become the vehicle carrying the whole future forward. And that's where China is, I believe. They're the first to come out with a photon computer chip. The heck was that? I don't know what that was, but it sounded like a windstorm just blew right through here for like a second. That was bizarre. So yeah, China with their photonic computer chips, they built the first assembly line to manufacture them faster. And they also just came out with this 9-qubit AI supercomputer that can predict the weather better than any machine out there so far today. So China, they realize what the problem is, and they're kicking ass to get around all these sanctions. Now, when most people think about empires, they imagine soldiers marching across continents, kings conquering rival kingdoms, or fleets crossing oceans to claim distant lands. Yet the greater empires have always been built upon something deeper than military strength alone. Now, Rome did not dominate the ancient world simply because it had legions. Rome dominated because it built roads, aqueducts, legal systems, and trade networks that connected vast territories into a single machine. And the military protected the system, but the system itself created the power. Now, the modern world operates under a similar principle. The empire of our age is not defined by territory as much as technology. Control over information, communications, finance, manufacturing, and computation has become the foundation of global influence. Nations may still possess armies and navies, but increasingly those forces depend upon technologies that determine who can see further, move faster, calculate better, and adapt more quickly than their competitors. Well, following the end of the Cold War, the United States emerged as the dominant technological power. Silicon Valley became synonymous with innovation. American universities attracted the world's brightest minds. Venture capital poured billions into new ideas. And the internet connected the planet through infrastructure largely designed and controlled by Western companies. Thus, software became one of the most valuable exports in history, generating wealth without the need for factories full of physical products. Software. Well, at the same time, semiconductor technology became the invisible foundation of modern civilization. Every smartphone, vehicle, server, communication network, financial transaction, and military platform all depended upon increasingly sophisticated computer chips. While most people never thought about semiconductors, they became as important as the 21st century as oil had to the 20th. Whoever controlled the flow of advanced computing controlled a significant portion of the modern economy. So over time, an extraordinary ecosystem emerged. American companies led chip design and software development, and European firms supplied critical manufacturing equipment. Taiwan perfected advanced semiconductor fabrication. South Korea dominated memory technologies. Global finance provided the capital needed for expansion. And together, these pieces formed a technological network so successful that many believed it would remain unchallenged for generations. Now, the system created immense benefits. Innovation accelerated, computing power expanded, communication became nearly instantaneous, entire industries were transformed, yet success often produces a hidden weakness. The longer a system remains dominant, the more its participants begin to assume that its structure is permanent. What once appeared as an advantage gradually became viewed as a law of nature. Alternative paths receive less attention because the existing path appears unbeatable. Well, history repeatedly demonstrates that no technological order remains permanent forever. Every dominant system eventually encounters its limits, competitors, or even entire new approaches. And the telegraph gave way to the telephone. Mainframe computers yielded to personal computers. Film cameras lost ground to digital photography. And the leaders of one era often struggled to recognize the beginning of the next because their success was built within the framework that is now being challenged. Now, as technology became the foundation of economic and military power, nations began recognizing a new reality. Dependence on another country's systems could create vulnerabilities. If access to critical technologies could be restricted, delayed, or denied, then technological dependence carried strategic risks. A nation might possess factories, workers, and capital, yet still find itself constrained if key components come from abroad. Dependency. And this realization became especially important as geopolitical competition intensified. The world was no longer debating who had the strongest military. Increasingly, the debate centered on who controlled the technologies that modern militaries, economies, and societies depended upon. Now, chips became strategic assets. Patents became geopolitical tools. Supply chains became matters of national security. And information itself became a source of power. And the technological empire of the modern age was not built overnight. It emerged through decades of innovation, investment, and global cooperation. Yet the very success of that system created incentives for others to seek alternatives. The question facing the world was no longer whether technology mattered. Everyone understood that. The real question was whether the existing technological order would remain intact or whether new players would discover ways to reshape the landscape. And China has done that. So that question would become the foundation of the spare tire revolution. Before a nation builds on alternatives, it must first recognize the danger of dependence. And before it can challenge the existing order, it must understand how that order was built in the first place. The technological empire appeared strong, stable, and permanent, yet beneath the surface, forces were already beginning to emerge that would challenge assumptions many believed could never be questioned. Yeah. So every empire has a weakness, right? Sometimes it is a mountain pass. Sometimes it's a shipping route. Sometimes it's a river that supplies water to millions of people. The strongest systems in history have often depended upon a handful of critical points that appears insignificant until someone realizes how important they truly are. Once those points are identified, they become leverage. They become pressure points. They become what strategists call choke points. And the modern technological world has its own choke points, and for many years they remained largely invisible to the public. Most people knew what a smartphone was, but very few understood how many nations, companies, and specialized technologies were required to build one. The device in a person's pocket represented the combined efforts of designers, manufacturers, software engineers, mining companies, logistics networks, and equipment suppliers spread across multiple continents. Well, the system was so efficient that many assumed it would always function smoothly. Well, in comes Trump. And one of the most important choke points turned out to be semiconductor manufacturing. Designing a chip and manufacturing a chip are two very different challenges. A company may create a brilliant design, but turning that design into billions of microscopic transistors requires machinery so advanced that only a handful of organizations on Earth possesses the capability. As chips become smaller and more powerful, the equipment required to manufacture them become increasingly specialized. And at the center of this reality stood a small number of companies controlling critical technologies. Advanced lithography systems, which create the computer wafers, the CPU wafers, they became particularly important because they determined how precisely circuits can be etched onto silicon wafers. Without access to the most advanced manufacturing tools, producing cutting-edge processors became extraordinarily difficult. What many people assumed was a competitive marketplace increasingly looked like a narrow bridge that everyone had to cross. And another choke point emerged in Taiwan. Over decades, Taiwan built one of the most sophisticated semiconductor manufacturing ecosystems in human history. Companies from all around the world came to rely on Taiwanese fabrication facilities because they consistently delivered advanced chips at scales few others could even match. And by the time many governments fully appreciated the strategic significance of this arrangement, a large portion of the global technology industry depended upon a relatively small geographic area. Well, that can't happen. Artificial intelligence introduced another layer of concentration. As machine learning systems became more powerful, demand exploded for specialized processors capable of performing vast numbers of calculations simultaneously. Graphics processing units, GPUs, originally developed for video games and visual applications, became the engines driving the AI revolution. And companies seeking to train advanced models found themselves competing for access to the same hardware. Once again, critical capabilities became concentrated within a limited number of suppliers. As geopolitical tensions increased, governments began viewing these technological dependencies through a national security lens. Export controls were expanded, restrictions were imposed, access to certain technologies became subject to political considerations. Policymakers argued that controlling critical technologies could preserve strategic advantages and slow potential competitors. Well, whether one agreed with those policies or not, they reflected a growing recognition that technology had become inseparable from power. Power. Now, the assumption behind many of these measures was straightforward. If access to advanced systems could be limited, then competitors would struggle to keep pace. Well, in theory, restricting key technologies would preserve existing advantages for years or even decades. Well, from a strategic perspective, the logic appeared very sound, and if a rival depends upon your infrastructure, then controlling that infrastructure provides the leverage. Yet history has a habit of producing unintended consequences. Choke points do not simply reveal weakness in those who depend upon them. They also reveal opportunity. And once a nation understands where the bottlenecks exist, it can begin searching for alternative paths. A restriction that was intended to preserve an advanced an advantage can sometimes motivate enormous investments in finding a workaround. And the more pressure applied to a choke point, the greater the incentives becomes to bypass it entirely. This is what China saw. And the dynamic has appeared throughout all of history as trade embargoes have inspired domestic industries, resource shortages have driven innovation, restrictions intended to slow development have occasionally accelerated it. When access to a critical system becomes uncertain, backup plans suddenly become strategic priorities. And what began as a defensive measure can evolve into a long-term effort to eliminate dependence altogether. So by the late 2010s and early 2020s, many nations were reassessing their vulnerabilities. And the question was no longer whether technological choke points existed. Their existence had become obvious. The real question was what countries would do in response. Now, some would continue relying on existing systems. Others would begin building alternatives. And among those pursuing alternatives, the one nation would embrace the concept of a spare tire more aggressively than any other. So the next stage of the story begins when a nation decides that dependence is no longer acceptable and starts preparing for a future in which every critical technology must have a backup plan. So most people think innovation begins with a breakthrough. A new invention appears, the world notices, and history changes. Well, in reality, many revolutions begin with fear. Not fear in the emotional sense, but fear of vulnerability, fear of dependence, fear that a critical system might disappear at the exact moment it's needed most. Well, the spare tire strategy emerged from this kind of thinking. It was not originally a plan to dominate the world. It was a plan to ensure that someone else could not stop the journey. And the phrase spare tire became associated with a simple but powerful idea. Every critical technology should have a backup. Every dependency should have an alternative. And every vulnerability should have a contingency plan. Engineers understand this principle instinctively. I do, especially when putting servers together. I own a service as a software company. Aircraft have redundant systems, and data centers maintain backup power. Banks create disaster recovery plans. So the greater the importance of a system, the more dangerous it becomes to rely upon a single point of failure. And for many years, China participated successfully in the global technology ecosystem. And it became a manufacturing powerhouse, attracting investments from all around the world, and factories expanded. Infrastructure grew. Supply chains became increasingly interconnected. Yet as geopolitical tensions increased, Chinese policymakers with engineers began seeing a problem. Many of the most important technologies remained dependent upon foreign suppliers. Access could be restricted. Licenses could be revoked. Equipment shipments could be delayed. The very systems that enable growth could also become instruments of pressure. Well, when sanctions and export restrictions began targeting key sectors, the lesson becomes impossible to ignore. A nation that depends upon another country's technology ultimately places part of its future under someone else's control. And whether those restrictions were justified or not is a separate debate. But the important point here is how they were interpreted. To many Chinese planners, they served as proof that technological independence was no longer optional. It had become a strategic necessity. And the response was not simply to copy existing products. That is a common misunderstanding. Okay, the objective was broader than replication. And the goal was to create alternatives across an entire ecosystem. Domestic chip development received increased funding, operating systems were expanded, artificial intelligence research accelerated, universities produced larger numbers of engineers, supply chains were redesigned to reduce exposure to external pressure. And every sector began asking the same question: what happens if access disappears tomorrow? Well, this shift in thinking transformed the purpose of innovation. Traditionally, many companies innovate to increase profits, capture market share, or improve performance. Now, the spare tire strategy introduced another motivation: resilience. Sometimes the backup system does not need to be better than the original. It simply needs to function well enough to prevent the paralysis. And once that backup exists, however, it often improves over time. Engineers refine it, researchers enhance it, companies invest in it, and what began as a substitute gradually evolves into a competitor. Well, the philosophy spread beyond semiconductors. Telecommunication infrastructure became a priority. Artificial intelligence platforms expanded. Energy technologies received support. Advanced manufacturing capabilities grew. The strategy resembled a giant national effort to identify every critical dependency and how it could be reduced. Well, in some cases, the alternatives lagged behind established Western systems. In others, they began approaching competitive performance. In a few areas, entirely different approaches started emerging. And what makes the spare tire strategy so important is that it changes the nature of competition, as traditional competition assumes everyone is playing the same game. One company builds a faster processor, another builds a slightly faster one. Well, one nation develops a more advanced system, and another nation attempts to catch up. So the spare tire approach asks a very different question entirely. Instead of competing directly, what if a new route could be created altogether? And what if the dependency itself could be eliminated? Well, history suggests that challengers often succeed when they stop imitating dominant powers and begin exploring alternative paths. The strongest empires tend to perfect alternative paths and existing systems because those systems created their success. And rising powers have fewer incentives to preserve the status quo. They are often more willing to experiment because they have less to lose. And the result is that innovation sometimes emerges from unexpected directions. And by the time much of the world recognized what was happening, the spare tire strategy had expanded far beyond emergency planning. It had become a framework for national development in China. Backup systems were evolving into independent ecosystems. Contingency plans were becoming long-term investments. So what started as a response to vulnerability was gradually transforming into a new model for technological competition. So the next question was whether these alternatives could survive real-time pressure, real-world pressures. Building a backup system is one thing, proving it can compete on a global stage is another. So that test would arrive sooner than many expected. And one of the first major examples would involve a company that much of the world has already written off. Remember Huawei? I used to call it Hawaii. It's Huawei. And every time I see the H, the W stops. I just go, Huawei. Well, here's the unexpected outcome with Huawei. There are moments in history when nearly everyone agrees on what is about to happen. Analysts make predictions, experts publish reports, financial markets react, governments formulate strategies based on assumptions that seem obvious. Then reality chooses a different path. The story of Huawei became one of those moments. It is important not because every prediction proved wrong, but because it revealed how difficult it can be to forecast the consequences of technological pressure. Now, by the late 2010s, Huawei had become one of the most significant technology companies in the world. Remember when the VP of technology, the lady was in Canada, she got arrested? Remember? She got arrested in Canada, which is weird now because Huawei and Canada are good friends. So its smartphones competed with the biggest names in consumer electronics. Its research spending rivaled that of some of the largest technology firms on Earth. And to supporters, Huawei represented China's emergence as a global technology power. And to critics, it represented a growing strategic concern. Well, what ended up happening was a cell phone from Huawei got in the hands of a technologist in America, and they opened it up, and there's a whole computer chip that operates completely different than the standards, and they couldn't figure out how it was working. Well, China figured a way around all of the patents of America. Now, as tensions between China and the West increased, Huawei became a focal point, restrictions were imposed, access to certain technologies became limited, relationships with suppliers became more complicated, advanced semiconductor access became increasingly difficult. And many observers believed the outcome was inevitable. A technology company deprived of critical components could struggle to survive. Some predicted Huawei would be permanently weakened. Others expected it to fade from prominence altogether. Well, the opposite happened. And at first glance, these predictions seemed reasonable. Modern technology companies operate within highly interconnected supply chains. Smartphones require processors, memory, software, sensors, manufacturing equipment, and countless of supporting technologies. Well, remove enough of those components and the entire machine can grind to a halt. The assumption was that dependence on external suppliers would become Huawei's greatest weakness. Yet something unexpected happened. Rather than collapsing, Huawei became a symbol of the spare tire strategy in action. The company invested heavily in domestic alternatives. Engineers searched for workarounds. Researchers accelerated development efforts. Partnerships expanded within China's growing technology ecosystem. So what had once been viewed as optional projects suddenly became urgent priorities. And resources flowed towards solutions that previously might have taken years longer to receive attention to. So this does not mean that the company emerged unscathed. Restrictions created real challenges for Huawei. Access to certain technologies remained limited, and competing globally became more complicated. Yet the outcome differed significantly from the complete collapse many had actually anticipated. Instead of disappearing, Huawei adapted. Instead of abandoning critical sectors, it expanded efforts to reduce dependency. So the pressure intended to constrain development also created incentives to innovate. So the broader lesson extended far beyond a single company. Policymakers around the world began asking an uncomfortable question. What if restrictions designed to preserve technological advances also encourage competitors to become more self-sufficient? What if pressure accelerates the creation of alternatives rather than preventing them? Well, the answers were not simple, but the debate became increasingly difficult to ignore. And this all happened within the last few years. So throughout history, similar patterns have appeared repeatedly. Nations facing resource shortages often become experts in efficiency. Industries confronted with barriers frequently discover new methods of production. Innovation does not always emerge from comfort. Sometimes it emerges from necessity. When familiar options disappear, creativity becomes a survival mechanism rather than a luxury. Now, Huawei's experience highlighted another important reality that technological ecosystems are rarely built overnight. They emerge through years of investment, education, research, and industrial development. And by the time restrictions intensified, China had already spent decades building universities, training engineers, expanding manufacturing capacity, and supporting scientific research. And the foundation for adaptation already existed. The pressure simply accelerated efforts that were already underway. So the story also challenged a common misconception about technological competition. Many people imagine innovation as a race to create a single best product. But in reality, innovation often involves building resilient systems capable of surviving disruption. And the strongest ecosystem is not always the one with the most advanced component. Sometimes it is the one that can continue functioning when conditions change unexpectedly. As Huawei adapted to its new environment, the spare tire philosophy gained credibility. Backup systems were no longer theoretical concepts discussed in planning meetings. They were being tested in real time, real-world conditions. And some succeeded, some struggled, but the larger principle remained intact. Dependence creates vulnerability, while alternatives create options. And the more options a nation possesses, the more flexibility it has when confronting uncertainty. So the unexpected outcome of the Huawei story was not that restrictions failed or that challenges disappeared. The unexpected outcome was that the effort to reduce dependence accelerated. And what many viewed as a defensive reaction gradually evolved into a broader technological transformation. And the focus was no longer simply on replacing missing components. The focus was beginning to shift toward entirely new approaches to computation, manufacturing, and design. Well, that shift would become increasingly important as the semiconductor industry approached a problem that no amount of political influence could solve. The challenge was not geopolitical, it was physical. The technologies that had powered decades of progress were beginning to encounter limits imposed by governments and by the laws of nature themselves. So, far more than a century, the semiconductor industry operated according to a simple expectation. Every few years, computer chips would become smaller, faster, cheaper, and more powerful. Engineers shrank transistors, increased performance, and reduced costs at a pace so consistent that it seemed almost magical. Entire industries were built around the assumption that tomorrow's computers would always be dramatically better than today's. Well, this expectation became known as Moore's Law, and for decades it served as the heartbeat of the digital age. Well, the success of this approach transformed civilization. Computers that once filled entire rooms eventually fit into pockets. Smartphones became more powerful than supercomputers from previous generations. Artificial intelligence, cloud computing, and global communications all benefited from relentless improvements in semiconductor technology. As long as transistors continued shrinking, the future appeared predictable. More power would simply arrive with the next generation of chips. Yet there was one problem. Physics does not negotiate. As transistors become smaller and smaller, engineers began approaching limits that could not be solved merely by spending more money. At microscopic scales, electrons behave differently. Heat becomes harder to manage. Manufacturing becomes more complicated. Tiny imperfections can ruin entire production runs. So the closer the industry moved toward atomic dimensions, the more difficult each advancement became. Progress did not stop, but it became increasingly expensive and increasingly challenging. Well, this created a dilemma for the technology world. For decades, the primary strategy had been simple: make everything smaller. Well, now that strategy was producing diminishing returns. Companies were investing enormous sums of achieved relatively modest gains, and the cost of building advanced fabrication facilities climbed into the tens of billions of dollars. And each new generation demanded greater complexity, more specialized equipment, and larger financial commitments. Well, forced with these realities, engineers began asking a different question. Well, what if the future of computing did not depend entirely on making transistors smaller? What if performance could be improved through entirely different approaches? Well, this shift in thinking opened the door to innovations that would have seemed secondary only just a few years ago. Well, one of the most promising developments involved advanced packaging. Instead of placing all components on a single piece of silicon, engineers began stacking and connecting multiple chips together. These chiplet architectures allowed specialized processors to work as a coordinated system. And rather than relying on one massive chip, designers could combine multiple components optimized for different tasks. In many cases, this approach improved efficiency while reducing manufacturing challenges. This is the folding I was talking about. Now, three-dimensional chip stacking pushed the concept even further. Instead of expanding horizontally across a flat surface, components could be arranged vertically. Engineers began treating chips less like individual devices and more like multi-story buildings. And the result was greater density, faster communication between components, and new opportunities for performance improvements. Some observers describe the shift as moving from single-family homes to skyscrapers within the world of semiconductors. This is where China's spare tire philosophy becomes particularly relevant. If access to the most advanced manufacturing processes is limited, alternative approaches suddenly became much more attractive. Advanced packaging, chip stacking, and modular architectures offer pathways that do not always require winning the race to produce the smallest transistor. They allow innovation to occur through design and integration rather than pure miniaturization. Now, the significance of this shift extends far beyond China. Researchers and companies around the world are exploring similar strategies because they address a challenge facing the entire industry. The future may not belong exclusively to those who build the smallest components. It may belong to those who discover the most efficient ways to combine them. In other words, the next leap forward could come from architecture rather than scale. History shows that industries often evolve this way. When one path becomes difficult, innovation spreads outward into new directions. Railroads eventually encountered limits, leading to automobiles and aviation. Vacuum tubes gave way to transistors, and mainframes yielded to personal computers. Progress rarely stops when obstacles appear. Instead, it just changes course. So what makes this moment particularly fascinating is that several new paths are emerging simultaneously, and advanced packaging is one of them. Quantum systems are another. Yet perhaps the most intriguing possibility involves abandoning electrons altogether. Because for generations, computers have processed information by moving electrical signals through silicon. Well, a growing number of researchers now believe the future may belong to something faster, cooler, and fundamentally different. Instead of computing with electricity, they are exploring the possibility of computing with light. The implications of that idea are so significant that they could reshape not only the artificial intelligence, but the entire technological landscape altogether. And in that race, some nations are investing heavily to ensure that they are not left behind. Now, we've done a show on this, computing with light. For more than 70 years, the digital world has been powered by electrons. Every email, financial transaction, video stream, search query, and artificial intelligent model ultimately depends on movement of electrical signals through increasingly complex circuits. Well, the entire information age was built upon the ability to control those electrons with extraordinary precision. And it has been one of the most successful technological achievements in human history. I would agree. Yet, the very success of electronic computing has created a new problem. Modern artificial intelligence systems require enormous amounts of computation. Data centers consume staggering quantities of electricity. Advanced AI models require thousands of specialized processors working together around the clock. Well, as demand grows, so does the need for power, cooling, and infrastructure. The world is discovering that intelligence may be abundant, but electricity is not. And every major technology company is confronting the same challenge. Training larger AI systems requires more computing power. More computing power produces more heat. More heat requires more cooling. More cooling requires more energy. Well, the cycle repeats itself until entire facilities resemble industrial power plants rather than traditional computer centers. And in some regions, concerns are already emerging about whether electrical grids can support future demand without significant upgrades. Well, this is where photonic computing enters the picture. Instead of using electrons to move and process information, photonic systems use light. At first glance, the concept sounds almost futuristic, yet light already powers much of the world's communications infrastructure. Fiber optic cables transmit vast amounts of information across oceans and continents at incredible speeds. And researchers began asking a simple question. If light is so effective for communication, could it also become effective for computation? Well, the attraction is obvious. Light travels extraordinarily fast. Photons generate less heat than electrons under many circumstances, and multiple wavelengths of light can carry information simultaneously. These characteristics suggest the possibility of computing systems that operate with greater efficiency and lower energy requirements than traditional electronic designs. Now, for a world increasingly concerned about AI power consumption, that possibility is difficult to ignore. Well, photonic computing remains an emerging field, and many engineering challenges still need to be solved. Researchers must determine how to build practical systems, integrate them with existing technologies, and manufacture them at scale. Yet progress continues to accelerate. Universities, startups, and major technology firms are all exploring different approaches. Some envision photonic accelerators working alongside traditional processors. Others imagine entirely new computing architectures built around optical principles. Well, China has shown particular interest in this area. Recognizing the importance of future computing technologies, Chinese researchers and manufacturers have invested heavily in photonics. And recent announcements regarding photonic chip production and assembly capabilities have attracted attention because they suggest an effort to participate in the next generation of computing rather than simply competing within the current one. And whether these initiatives ultimately succeed remains to be seen, but that direction itself is significant. And it will succeed. They will. They've already made the computer chips that run on photons. So the strategic implications are difficult to overlook. If artificial intelligence becomes one of the defining technologies of the century, then the infrastructure supporting AI becomes equally important. A nation capable of dramatically reducing the energy costs of computation gains a powerful advantage. Lower cost means larger deployments. Greater efficiency means fewer constraints. Improved scalability means faster expansion. So the race is no longer just about processing information. It's about processing information sustainably. And what makes photonic computing especially interesting is how it fits in the broader spare tire philosophy. Instead of attempting to win a competition defined entirely by traditional silicon, researchers are exploring a fundamentally different path. And the question is not whether photonic systems are currently superior in every application. The question is whether they might become superior in the applications that matter most tomorrow. So, throughout history, transformative technologies often appear impractical before they become indispensable. Early automobiles were dismissed by supporters of horse-drawn transportation. Early computers seemed too expensive and specialized to reach ordinary households. Early internet connections appeared too slow to transform global commerce. And new technologies rarely arrive fully to mature. So they evolve gradually until suddenly the world realizes the old assumptions no longer apply. Well, the most important lesson may be that the future of computing is becoming increasingly diverse. Silicon is no longer the only path under consideration. Engineers are exploring stacked architectures, specialized accelerators, quantum systems, neuromorphic designs, and photonic processors all simultaneously. And the result is a technological landscape that looks far less predictable than it did a few decades ago. So, among these emerging possibilities, one recent experiment captured global attention because it challenged a deeply rooted assumption about computing. The experiment involved neither a giant data center nor a massive supercomputer. Instead, it relied upon a remarkably small quantum system. Its significance was not that it replaced artificial intelligence. Its significance was that it demonstrated how a tiny system might accomplish tasks that previously seemed to require something much larger. Well, that result has forced researchers to ask whether efficiency rather than scale may ultimately define the next chapter of the technology race. So here comes the 9-spin surprise. Now, for the past several years, the technology industry has largely followed one philosophy: bigger is better. Bigger models, bigger data centers, bigger training clusters, bigger investments. And whenever a new artificial intelligence breakthrough appeared, the solution often seemed to involve adding more processors, more memory, and more electricity. Well, the assumption was that intelligence emerged from scale. And if a system performed well today, then a larger version would likely perform even better tomorrow. And this is where America is in big, deep trouble, because they're going to build a bunch of big old data centers with a bunch of GPUs, CPUs, and all that stuff. It's going to be all outdated by the time China comes out with something even better. And that belief has driven one of the largest infrastructure expansions in modern history. Governments are discussing new power plants to support artificial intelligence. Technology companies are spending hundreds of billions of dollars on data centers, and entire regions are competing to attract AI infrastructure. Well, the race resembles an industrial revolution built around computation rather than steel or oil. This is the fourth industrial revolution that Klaus Schwab was talking about. Then a small experiment attracted attention for an unexpected reason. Researchers demonstrated that a quantum reservoir system built around only 9 interacting quantum spins could outperform certain classical reservoir computing systems containing thousands of nodes when performing specific forecasting tasks. Well, the headlines quickly appeared, and some claimed quantum computing had defeated artificial intelligence. Others suggested massive data centers were becoming obsolete. As often happens with scientific breakthroughs, the reality was both more nuanced but more interesting. The experiment did not prove that 9 quantum bits could replace ChatGPT. It did not demonstrate artificial general intelligence, and it did not eliminate the need for advanced processors or modern computing infrastructure. But what it did demonstrate was that a very small physical system could perform a specialized prediction task with remarkable efficiency. Less money, less power, less problems. That distinction is important because it points toward a larger lesson about the future of computation. Now, for decades, engineers have focused on increasing computational power by adding more resources, more transistors, more processors, more memory. Yet nature frequently reminds us that efficiency can be just as important as scale. A human brain consumes only a fraction of the energy used by modern AI training systems. Biological organisms routinely solve complex problems using remarkably limited resources. And the question raised by the 9-spin experiment is whether certain physical systems possess computational advantages that traditional architecture struggle to replicate. Well, quantum reservoir computing approaches problems differently from conventional computing. Rather than programming every step explicitly, researchers allow the natural dynamics of a quantum system to transform information. Well, the physical interactions themselves become part of the computation. Instead of forcing the machine to calculate every possibility through brute force, The properties of the system help perform some of the work. And this approach is still in its early stage, but it represents a fundamentally different way of thinking about computation altogether. And what makes this especially relevant to the spare tire revolution is that it challenges assumptions about the path forward. The dominant strategy today is to build larger systems. The 9-spin experiment suggests another possibility. And perhaps some future breakthroughs will come not from building larger machines, but from discovering more efficient physical architectures. So the winning approach may not always involve adding resources. It may involve using different resources altogether. And that's something that I don't think America is paying attention to right now. I don't think that they're looking at all these big contracts that they're putting in for all these data centers and actually thinking smartly, is all of this going to be obsolete and replaced by just one freaking computer that China is going to create in the future because they were forced to do it alternatively? Well, this idea resonates with broader trends across the technology world. In photonic computing, it seeks to use light rather than electrons, and neuromorphic computing attempts to mimic aspects of biological brains. Advanced packaging reorganizes how processors communicate. Quantum systems explore entirely new computational principles. And in each case, researchers are asking whether the next step or the next leap forward requires a different architecture rather than a larger version of the existing one. Well, the significance of prediction should not be overlooked. Forecasting is one of the most valuable activities in the modern world, and weather systems, supply chains, financial markets, and energy grids, and transportation networks, and military logistics all depend upon the ability to anticipate future conditions. Well, small improvements in predictive accuracy can create enormous economic and strategic advantages. If alternative computing architecture becomes exceptionally good at forecasting complex systems, they can become some of the most valuable technologies ever developed. And this is why governments, universities, and corporations continue investing heavily in quantum research despite the field's challenges. So the goal is not merely to build a faster computer. The goal is to discover new forms of computation capable of solving problems that remain difficult for conventional systems. And whether quantum reservoirs ultimately fulfill that promise remains uncertain, but the experiment demonstrates that surprising results are possible. And the deeper question and deeper lesson of the 9-spin surprise from China is that technological revolutions often begin at the edges. They start with experiments that appear small, specialized, or even insignificant. Most never transform the world. A few do. But the difficulty is knowing which breakthroughs represent temporary curiosities and which represent the first glimpse of a new era. Well, if the future belongs to efficiency rather than scale, then the technology race may look different from what most people expect. The winner may not be the nation that builds the largest data center. It may be the nation that discovers how to achieve the same result within a fraction of the resources. And if that is true, then the next great battle will not simply be about computing power. It will be about energy, infrastructure, and growing realization that even the most powerful technologies eventually encounter limits. Well, those limits are already beginning to appear in the world of artificial intelligence. So every technological revolution eventually encounters a wall. Not a wall of imagination, not a wall of ambition, but a wall of reality. Railroads needed steel. Steamships needed coal. Automobiles needed oil. And the internet needed fiber optics and electrical grids. Well, every great leap forward ultimately depends upon physical resources. Yeah. And artificial intelligence is beginning to discover that it is no exception. For years, the public conversation around AI focused almost entirely on software. People talked about chatbots, image generators, coding assistants, and digital companions. And the visible products captured attention, while the infrastructure powering those products remained largely hidden. Yet behind every AI response sits a vast network of processors, storage systems, cooling equipment, power lines, and facilities operating around the clock. What appears effortless on a screen often requires extraordinary resources behind the scenes. Well, as AI systems became larger and more capable, the demand for computational power exploded. Training advanced models required thousands of specialized processors working simultaneously for weeks or months. Running those models for millions of users requiring even more infrastructure, and technology companies began announcing data center projects measured not in millions of dollars, but in the tens of hundreds of billions. So the scale of investment resembled the construction of industrial cities rather than traditional computer facilities. Oh, climate change, they stop that because they're gonna help improve the death of the world through data centers. Leave it to the bankers. At first, this expansion appeared limitless. Investors supplied capital, governments offered incentives, utility companies planned upgrades. Yet beneath the enthusiasm, engineers began confronting a difficult question. How much power can society realistically devote to computation? Well, the answer is not purely technological. It's economic, political, and physical. Electricity is becoming one of the most important variables in the AI race. A nation may possess talented engineers and advanced processors, but without sufficient power generation, computational growth eventually slows. So, gone are the days of cheap electricity, folks. And the demand continues rising as AI models become even more sophisticated. And some facilities already require as much power as small cities. Future projects may require even more. Cooling introduces another challenge. Computers generate heat, and advanced AI systems generate a great deal of it. And removing that heat requires energy, water, or both. As data centers expand, questions emerge regarding water availability, environmental impact, infrastructure strain, and long-term sustainability. Well, these concerns are not limited to any one country. They affect every nation pursuing large-scale AI development. And the result is a growing realization that brute force scaling may not continue forever. For the past decade, many advances come from increasing the size of models and the amount of computation applied to them. That strategy produced remarkable results, but it also created a dependency on ever-expanding infrastructure. The larger the models became, the more resources that they actually demanded. And at some point, efficiency becomes as important as raw capability. So this is where the spare tire revolution intersects with the broader technology race. If the current path requires massive increases in electricity, water, and hardware, then alternative approaches become increasingly attractive. A photonic processor that consumes less energy becomes valuable. A quantum system that solves specialized problems more efficiently becomes valuable. And a new architecture that delivers comparable results with fewer resources becomes valuable. Well, the incentives to integrate grows as the cost of scaling rises. And history offers numerous examples of this pattern. Early industrial factories consumed vast quantities of labor until automation improved efficiency. Aircraft became more economical not simply by growing larger, but by improving engines, material, and design. Progress often begins with expansion and eventually shifts toward optimization. So the most successful technologies are rarely those that consume the most resources. They are the ones that achieve the greatest results from the least expenditure. China appears to understand this reality. So does the United States. So do researchers in Europe, Japan, South Korea, and elsewhere. The competition is increasingly focused on efficiency because efficiency determines sustainability. A technology that requires unlimited resources is not truly scalable. A technology that produces more output with fewer inputs becomes strategically powerful. So the irony is that artificial intelligence may be teaching humanity an old lesson. Bigger is not always better. Bigger can be impressive, bigger can dominate headlines, bigger can attract investment, but history frequently rewards those who discover how to accomplish more with less. So the nations that solve the efficiency problem may ultimately gain advantages that no amount of brute force spending can even replicate. And as the world approaches this data center wall, attention is beginning to shift towards a deeper question. If computation is becoming one of the most valuable resources on the earth, then what is the ultimate purpose of all of this processing power? Why are governments, corporations, and researchers investing so heavily in systems capable of analyzing vast quantities of information? Well, the answer leads directly to the next stage of the story. The real prize is not the computer itself. The real prize is prediction. And that's the prediction economy, and that's coming. Throughout history, wealth has been built upon the control of valuable resources, and empires fought over farmland because food meant survival. Nations competed for gold because gold represented stability and trade. The industrial age revolved around coal and oil because energy powered factories, transportation, and economic growth. Every era has its defining resource, and the resource of the emerging age may be something far less visible than anything that came before it. Well, that resource is prediction. Most people think of prediction as a weather forecast or a market outlook, but in reality, prediction sits at the center of nearly every major system in modern society. Businesses attempt to predict consumer demand, banks attempt to predict economic activity, governments attempt to predict energy consumption, military attempts to predict adversary behavior, supply chains attempt to predict shortages before they occur. So the more accurately future conditions can be anticipated, the greater the advantage becomes. And for centuries, prediction was limited by human capacity. Analysts could only process so much information. Decision makers relied on experience, intuition, and incomplete data. And even the most sophisticated forecasting methods struggled to account for the complexity of modern systems. Then computing changed everything. Suddenly, vast quantities of information could be collected, organized, analyzed, and compared at speeds impossible for human beings alone. Artificial intelligence accelerated this transformation. Modern AI systems excel at identifying patterns hidden within enormous data sets. They can detect relationships that might otherwise go unnoticed. They can evaluate millions of variables simultaneously. And while AI does not possess a perfect forecast, it can often improve forecasting accuracy by revealing trends that traditional methods overlook. So the result is a growing race to gather more data, build larger models, and improve predictive capabilities. Well, this explains why so much attention is focused on computation. The goal is not simply to create smarter machines. The goal is to improve decision-making. A shipping company that predicts disruptions before competitors gain an advantage. An energy provider that forecasts demand more accurately gains an advantage. A financial institution that recognizes changing market conditions first gains an advantage, and prediction converts information into economic value. Well, weather forecasting provides a useful example as modern societies depend upon accurate forecasts for agriculture, transportation, disaster preparation, energy distribution, and countless other activities. Small improvements in predictive accuracy can save lives and reduce cost. The same principle applies to supply chains, financial markets, public health systems, and military planning. So better forecasts creates better outcomes. And the organization that predicts more accurately often acts more effectively. And this is where the emerging technologies such as quantum reservoirs, photonic processors, and advanced AI systems have become strategically important in China. Their value is not measured solely by raw computational power. Their value is measured by the quality of the predictions that they enable. And a system capable of identifying future patterns more efficiently than competitors becomes an asset of extraordinary significance. So in many cases, even a modest improvement in forecasting can justify enormous investment. Thus, the implications extend far beyond economics, because throughout history, information has always been linked to power. Kings relied on scouts, governments relied on intelligence services, corporations relied on market research, and the digital age has amplified these dynamics dramatically. The ability to collect, process, and interpret information now operates on a global scale, and every transaction, communication, shipment, and interaction generates data. Well, the challenge is transforming that data into actionable knowledge. This is one of the reasons the technology race has become so intense. Nations are not merely competing to build faster computers. They're competing to improve their understanding of increasingly complex systems. The country that can better forecast economic shifts, supply disruptions, energy demand, technological trends, or geopolitical developments gains strategic flexibility. Better information does not guarantee success, but it does improve the odds of making effective decisions. And viewed from this lens, many seemingly unrelated developments begin to connect. Data centers are not simply warehouses full of computers. They're now prediction factories. Artificial intelligence is not merely an automation tool. It's a forecasting engine. And quantum research is not only an academic exercise, it's an exploration of new methods for processing information. Thus, photonic computing is not just about speed. It's about enabling larger and more efficient analytical systems. Well, the spare tire revolution ultimately points towards the same conclusion. The nations investing in alternative computing architectures are not simply trying to build different machines. They're trying to secure future capabilities. They understand that the information has become one of the most valuable assets in the world, and that the ability to transform information into prediction may define the next era of competition. Well, this changes the rules of the game. One of the greatest mistakes in history is assuming that the future will look like the present. Every dominant power eventually falls into this trap. Success creates confidence. Confidence creates assumptions. Assumptions creates blind spots. The system that generated prosperity and influence begins to appear permanent, and because they appear permanent, leaders often struggle to recognize when the foundations beneath them are beginning to shift. Well, the Roman Empire believed its roads and military structure would endure indefinitely. It didn't. The great maritime powers believed control of the seas guaranteed their future. Industrial nations believed factories and raw materials would remain the ultimate source of strength. Well, in each case, a new development emerged that altered the landscape. The change was rarely obvious at first. It often appeared small, inefficient, or incomplete compared to the dominant system of the day. Yet over time, the new approach matured, while the old approach became increasingly difficult to defend. Well, China's approach reflects this reality. Rather than focusing exclusively on matching every existing technology, China has increasingly invested in alternative pathways. Advanced packaging seeks to improve performance without relying entirely on smaller transistors. Photonic computing explores the use of light rather than electricity. Quantum research investigates entirely different methods of computation. And domestic manufacturing ecosystems reduce exposure to external pressure. Each initiative represents a different route toward the same destination, technologically capable without strategic dependence. And what makes the current moment unique is that the future remains unusually uncertain. No one can say with confidence whether photonic computing will transform artificial intelligence. No one knows whether quantum reservoirs will become commercially important. And no one knows whether chip stacking will prove more significant than transistor scaling over the long term. But several competing visions of the future are advancing at the same time, and the winners have not yet been determined. So the spare tire was never intended to replace the vehicle. It was designed as insurance against uncertainty, yet history has a strange habit of elevating backup plans into primary strategies. What begins as a contingency plan can become a revolution. What began as an alternative can become a standard. And what begins as a response to vulnerability can become the foundation of a new era. Well, that's why this story matters tonight. It's not merely just about China. It's not merely about America. It's about the possibility that the technological rules governing the modern world are changing. The nation that recognizes this shift early will have the greatest opportunity to shape what comes next. Because people are going to get tired of America, regardless of what president they have. And the nations that assume the old rules are permanent may discover too late that the game has already changed. So to conclude, when historians look back at the great turning points, they often discover that most of the changes were not obvious at the time. People living through these moments saw individual events, but failed to recognize the larger pattern connecting them. Well, today, guys, you are witnessing history with China and how they went around and created their own computer chips in a whole different way, and using alternatives are going to beat America. That's what we're going to see. Now, it may not happen within the next few years, but you're seeing the turning point and what's going on, and you know exactly what China is up to. A new process emerged. A breakthrough occurred in a laboratory that seemed disconnected from the rest of the world in a Chinese university. And only years later did it become clear that the separate developments were actually pieces of a much larger transformation. So the spare tire revolution may represent one of those moments. Most people are isolated headlines. Most people. They see semiconductor restrictions. They see AI breakthroughs, photonic chips, quantum experiments, and massive data center construction projects. Yet beneath those headlines lies a deeper story about technological independence, about resilience, and the search for entirely new ways of computing. What appears fragmented on the surface begins to look remarkably connected when viewed from a wider perspective. And for decades, the dominant assumption was that technological leadership would continue along a familiar path. Smaller transistors would produce more powerful chips, larger data centers would generate more capable artificial intelligence, and existing supply chains would continue expanding. Well, the future would simply be a larger version of the present. Yet the pressures now emerging throughout the industry through greed suggests that the next chapter may be far less predictable than many expected. And China's response to technological pressure offers an important lesson regardless of where one stands politically. Faced with dependencies it considered dangerous, it chose to build alternatives, and some of those alternatives remain behind established competitors. Others are improving rapidly, and a few may eventually help define entirely new industries. Whether every effort succeeds is almost besides the point. The strategy itself reveals an understanding that dependence creates vulnerability, while options create freedom. And perhaps that is the most important lesson of this entire discussion. History is filled with examples of dominant systems that appeared unstoppable until a different approach emerged. Always. The strongest fortress eventually encountered a new weapon. The fastest ship eventually encountered a new engine. And the most powerful technology eventually encounters a new idea. And progress does not always come from improving the existing system. Sometimes it comes from questioning the assumptions that built it. So the spare tire was never supposed to be the star of the journey. And that may be the true significance of what we are witnessing today. The world is not simply competing over chips, patents, and artificial intelligence. It's competing over the future architecture of technological power itself. Somewhere in a laboratory, a university, a startup, or a manufacturing facility, the next chapter may already be taking shape. And when history finally identifies the turning point, it may discover that the revolutions did not begin with the biggest machine. It began with a spare tire.
This has been Cause Before Symptom with your host, James Carner. Go to his website, jamescarner.com, and sign up for his newsletter. Also, download his free books on the breath war, the crown of blood, and the ritual machine. Fix your body by buying his award-winning detox formula, removing heavy metals and parasites. You'll feel better and live longer. Go to elitepotion.com. And one more thing, please. Just try and love your neighbor, because if you do, the world would be a better place. See you tomorrow.